Oh, hi there! You must be the new student. Welcome to my class. My name is Jordy. I'm going to be your teacher, but for you, it will be Master Artist, all right? This is not going to be an ordinary class. Oh no. I'm going to teach you everything about color correction and color grading inside Adobe Premiere Pro, which is an art, all right? So let's take your pencil. We're going to dive straight into it, or you can take your mouse, might be easier. In this video, I want to show you how to make your videos pop. I don't like long theory lessons, no. Art is about experience. So we're going to dive straight into it and do something. What I've got right here is a clip of a beautiful girl. That's right, I'm into romanticism a lot. And what we're going to do is make this shot just pop a bit more. And for that, we're going to have to call up the color correction tools. Now, as of the Creative Cloud version of Premiere Pro, all of the color grading and color correction tools can all be found back within the Lamberti color grading panel. And to call that one up, we can just head over to the menu on top, select Window, and from there, choose Lamberti Color. A sidebar will open up, and let me just enlarge this right here, with different tabs. We got Basic Correction, Creative, Curves, Color Wheels and Match, HSL Secondary, Vignettes, but that is all for later in this class. You are a beginner at this moment, so let's start with the Basic Correction tab. And since you've just arrived here and probably know nothing about art, we're going to skip the first settings as well. So don't mind input LUT yet, don't mind the temperature and tint sliders just yet. Let's focus here on the tone. The tone is where your painting starts with. It are the different levels in your shot. For example, we got exposure, which will, just simply increase the exposure, make your shot brighter or make your shot less bright. It's that simple. And by the way, whenever you change a setting in here, you can always double click on your slider to reset that to the default value. Next up, we got contrast. Increasing the contrast will add more contrast. Basically, it will just separate the darker areas of your shot with the brighter areas of your shot. It will make your shadows deeper and your brighter areas brighter. That is what contrast is all about. Now, one thing that my students often forget is that contrast also adds saturation to your shot. Saturation is basically how vivid your colors are. Let me just show that to you with the saturation slider here on the bottom. So by increasing that, your colors will be more vivid. You can even decrease that to go all the way to black and white, like in the old days when paint wasn't invented yet. Let me just reset that back. So that also means if we're going to decrease the contrast, we will also lose colors. And you can see that perfectly here in our scarf. That orange is now less saturated. So increasing that back will saturate that scarf a lot more. Now let me reset that back and let's have a look at the 4 controls that we have here down below. Now here's the funny part. The highlights, the shadows, the whites, and the blacks are actually also kind of contrast controls. With these 4 things, I can do the exact same thing as what contrast does. Only if I will create my contrast using these 4 sliders, I actually have way more control over how I will create my contrast. And to showcase that better, I've got a picture right here on my timeline as well. On the very left side, we can find the absolute darkest blacks. And there's a control for that, which is the blacks, the absolute blacks. Then we've got the shadows, or, more the little bit brighter blacks, those very deep gray areas. These right here are the shadows. Then we've got the midtones, which lay beautifully in the middle. Then we've got the highlights, which are the bright areas, but not as bright as the brightest areas, which are the absolute whites. Usually the absolute whites are going to be those parts which are overexposed, and the absolute blacks are those parts which are a little bit maybe underexposed. So when going back to our shot of the beautiful girl right here, we can create contrast with these sliders as well. What I'm going to do is maybe first bring down the blacks a little bit, the absolute blacks. So you can see that it is working here in the corner, the absolute darkest areas. Now I'm not going to push this too far because this will separate the blacks from the shadows way too far. And you can kind of see what is happening here. By the way, guys, if you stand on the value of these sliders and drag it out from there, you can even go further than -100. Look at that. Now what occurs right now is something that we call banding. You will actually start to see the line between the absolute black areas and the rest, or the shadows. So this means that our blacks now are way too deep. So we have to make sure that these things are kind of in balance. So let me just reset the blacks again, and let's just decrease that a tiny bit. Like just a tiny bit, not too much. What you mostly want to do is work on the shadows. The shadows is that area where you still see a lot of detail in, like the tree here on the left side. Let me just decrease that and see how beautiful the shot now becomes. We're making those shadow areas a little bit more darker to add that contrast in there. And the same thing goes for the highlights and the whites. You know, if you want the girl to pop, I'm going to push on the highlights because her shirt is bright, but it are not the absolute whites. The absolute whites are usually in the sky. So let's just increase the highlights a tiny bit. As you can see, we are making her brighter. By the way, also the highlights can be found back in the skin tones. So the highlights is a great slider to make your subject pop. Now when changing any of these sliders right here, an effect called Lumetri color will automatically be applied to your clip, which can be found back in your effect controls. So what I want to do here is just delete the Lumetri effect, which will also reset everything in here. In a shot like this, which is very flat, as you can see here, we don't really have a deep contrast going on. We can perfectly see the sky. There's nothing overexposed, nothing underexposed. It's a very flat shot. Of course, in an example like this, it is much better to just increase the contrast, as it's easier to do and we got so much room to play with. But what if you end up with a shot that already has lots of contrast by its source? Well, here's an example of that. This shot right now has way too much contrast. This is looking more video-ish. And we want to create something that is more cinematic, which means soft highlights, soft shadows. But still, we want to retain that contrast. Let me show you how that is done. So the blacks are definitely okay. I want to keep them. I want to keep the contrast in the blacks. But I like to introduce a bit more detail, definitely here in those bushes here. So what I can do is simply increase the shadows. I'm bringing up the exposure of the shadows, but I'm not touching the blacks, which means that we keep that deepness in the blacks. And the same goes for her. Her skin, her blouse, it's starting to clip. It's starting to become overexposed. But I don't want to touch the sky in the back. I want to keep that bright. So let's decrease the highlights. And as you can see, we are bringing back those details. We are making the shot softer, more cinematic, while retaining contrast. And that is how to make your shot pop the right way. Now you're probably thinking, like, what is too much contrast? When do I have too less contrast? Well, that is for the next lesson, where we're going to take a look at the waveform tool, a measurement tool to measure your shot and see how much contrast we can add in there. That's right, you always have to measure, like this green, maybe this green is too much. Let's add a little bit of blue in there. You know, you have to measure that before you can start on a chicken painting over there.